Have you ever seen a child so brave that she stopped an entire courtroom in silence? When this little girl pointed her finger and shouted, "She's not guilty, my stepmother is," everyone froze, even the judge. What could drive a child to defend her maid against her own family? Before we go on, allow me to wish you peace and good health. Tell me from which country and at what time are you watching this story? Good evening, friends. Let me take you to a quiet little town tucked deep in Fayette County, Texas, the kind of place where folks still wave from their porches and the church bell marks the rhythm of each day. The mornings smell like coffee and pecan pie, and people talk softly about the weather before they talk about anything else. It was in this peaceful town that Grace Holloway had built her small, humble life, never imagining that a storm was already gathering just beyond her horizon. Grace had lived in Fayetteville for nearly 10 years, ever since she lost her husband in a trucking accident on Highway 71. She worked as a housekeeper for Richard Whitmore, a kind-hearted widower who owned the local farm supply store. His house sat on a little hill surrounded by oak trees and the sound of crickets in the evening. Grace kept it tidy, always humming old hymns as she worked. There was a calmness in her, the kind that only comes from people who have learned to live with loss. Most mornings began the same way. The smell of biscuits baking, the soft laughter of a little girl, and Grace's gentle voice floating through the kitchen. 5-year-old Lila Whitmore sat at the table coloring while Grace packed her school lunch peanut butter sandwich, apple slices, a cookie shaped like a heart. "You always make them too pretty to eat," Lila said, swinging her legs. Grace smiled and brushed a curl from the child's forehead. "Then you'll just have to eat them pretty, sweetheart." The two of them had grown inseparable since Richard's first wife passed away. Grace had been more than a housekeeper. She was a steady hand, a warm voice at bedtime, and the only person who could braid Lila's hair without pulling. To the little girl, Grace wasn't Miss Holloway. She was home. Outside, autumn had begun to paint the trees in gold and rust. From the kitchen window, Grace could see the neighbors putting up hay bales for the upcoming fall festival. The world looked peaceful, but a strange unease brushed through her heart that morning, one of those feelings a woman learns not to ignore. When Richard came down the stairs, adjusting his tie, he looked unusually nervous. "Morning, Grace," he said, his voice hesitant. "Could you sit for a minute? There's something I'd like to tell you." Grace wiped her hands on a towel and nodded. He smiled, the kind of smile that tries to prepare you for something you won't like. "I've met someone," he began softly. "Her name's Vanessa Sterling. She works in Austin in marketing. We've been seeing each other for a few months. And, well, I asked her to marry me." For a moment, Grace just stood still. Behind her, the kettle began to whistle. "That's wonderful news, Mr. Whitmore," she said finally, forcing a kind smile. "Lila will be happy to have another woman in the house." "Oh," Richard sighed, almost in relief. "I knew you'd understand. Vanessa's coming by this afternoon. I'd like you and Lila to meet her properly." Grace nodded again, but as she turned back to the stove, her hand trembled slightly. The smell of coffee filled the room, but the warmth had gone out of it. Later that day, the wind shifted, bringing a cooler edge. Grace dressed Lila in a blue dress and braided her hair neatly. The girl tugged on her sleeve, whispering, "Is Daddy's friend nice?" Grace knelt and met her eyes. "We'll find out together, honey. Just remember to be polite." The sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the quiet. A silver sedan stopped in front of the house, shining even in the dim light. A woman stepped out tall, perfectly groomed, wrapped in a cream-colored coat. Her heels clicked against the porch wood, sharp and deliberate. "Vanessa Sterling," she said with a practiced smile, extending a hand to Grace. "You must be the famous Miss Holloway. I've heard you keep this place running." Grace shook her hand, noticing the coolness of her fingers. "Just doing my job, ma'am." Lila peeked from behind Grace's skirt, clutching her teddy bear. Vanessa bent down with a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And this must be little Lila, aren't you, darling?" The girl nodded shyly, inching closer to Grace. Richard came out, beaming, oblivious to the tension hanging in the air. "Well, now we're all together," he said cheerfully. "Let's have supper." Grace made her pecan pie. It's her specialty. They gathered around the dining table as the last light of day slipped through the window. Vanessa complimented the decor in soft tones, her gaze drifting over every corner of the house, the old photos, the cross above the mantel. the small framed picture of Richard's late wife. Grace caught her lingering there and felt a chill. Vanessa's smile didn't falter, but her eyes told another story, one of quiet calculation. Dinner passed quietly, though something in the air had changed. Grace could feel it between every word, in every polite smile that didn't quite reach the heart. Vanessa praised the meal with perfect manners, yet her voice carried a kind of distance, as though she were already rearranging the furniture in her mind. When she complimented the silverware, she said, "Such charming pieces. I suppose they belong to his late wife?" Richard didn't notice the pause in Grace's hand as she poured tea. He just nodded, proud to see everyone together at last. Lila, usually chatty, sat silent through most of the meal. Her little fingers tore the crust of her pie without eating much. From time to time, she glanced at Grace, seeking comfort in her eyes, the same way she did when thunderstorms rolled across the valley. After dinner, Richard went to take a phone call in his office, leaving the two women and the child at the table. Vanessa folded her napkin neatly and looked around. "You've done a fine job keeping things running here, Grace," she said softly. "It must be tiring, taking care of everything, including other people's children." The words were smooth but cold. Grace met her gaze for just a second, then lowered it. "It's never tiring when you love them," she replied. Vanessa smiled again, but it was the kind of smile that pressed like frost against a window. When Richard returned, Vanessa was standing near the fireplace, studying the framed photo of his late wife, a gentlewoman with kind eyes. "She had lovely taste," Vanessa murmured, "for a small-town woman." Her tone was sweet, yet something sharp hid underneath. Grace froze. She wanted to speak, to defend the memory of the woman who had once called her a friend, but she said nothing. Richard didn't seem to notice. He only put an arm around Vanessa's shoulder, proud and unsuspecting. As evening settled over the valley, the house grew quiet again. The cicadas hummed outside, and a soft rain began to fall. Lila was in her pajamas, curled on the sofa beside Grace, drawing in her little notebook. "Miss Grace," she whispered, "will she take you away from me?" Grace smoothed the child's hair, her heart aching at the tremor in that tiny voice. "No one can take away what's in here," she said gently, placing a hand over Lila's chest. "Not love, not truth, not memories. They live right there forever." Lila smiled sleepily and hugged her teddy bear. "Then I'll keep you here," she said, touching her own chest. Grace chuckled softly, though her eyes glistened in the dim lamplight. Later, when everyone had gone to bed, Grace stood alone in the kitchen, washing the last of the dishes. The old clock above the sink ticked steadily, marking another quiet Texas night. Through the window, lightning flickered on the horizon, a brief flash illuminating the oak trees that guarded the property. The air was heavy, the way it gets before a storm. She dried her hands and turned off the light. But before stepping away, she caught her reflection in the window. For an instant, she saw another figure behind her, Vanessa, standing in the hallway, watching silently. Grace turned. The hallway was empty. Only the sound of rain tapping the roof answered her. She exhaled, half laughing at herself. "You're getting jumpy, old girl," she murmured. But the unease didn't fade. Something about that woman's eyes, so calm, so clever, made her feel like the ground beneath this peaceful home was beginning to shift. Upstairs, in the faint glow of a nightlight, Lila stirred in her sleep. The little girl's teddy bear slipped from her arm and fell to the floor with a soft thud. Grace bent to pick it up, whispering, "Don't worry, sweetheart. Everything's fine." But as she tucked the bear back under Lila's arm, thunder rolled across the hills like a warning. By the time Grace returned to her small room downstairs, the rain had turned into a downpour. The window rattled in its frame, and a streak of lightning lit the sky, splitting her reflection across the glass. For a brief moment, she saw two halves of herself, one calm and steady, the other afraid and uncertain. She stood there, staring, feeling that strange whisper of trouble again. Outside, the storm gathered strength. The oak branches swayed violently, scattering wet leaves against the porch. From her window, Grace could see the faint outline of Vanessa's car parked under the trees, its silver body catching each flash of lightning like a blade of light. The house creaked, old wood shifting with the wind. Grace crossed herself quietly, whispering the prayer her mother used to say on stormy nights. "Lord, keep us safe and keep our hearts true." And then, as thunder echoed through the valley, She watched a single light flick on upstairs Vanessa's window. The woman stood there, looking down at the yard, her silhouette sharp against the curtain. Grace couldn't see her face, only the stillness of someone who never truly slept. That night, long after the rain stopped, Grace dreamed of doors closing and voices whispering her name. Somewhere in the distance, she could still hear the church bell ringing soft, slow, like a warning wrapped in prayer. That was the night Fayetteville stopped being quiet. The next morning dawned with a pale Texas sun, weak and uncertain after the night's storm. Dew clung to the fence posts, and the air smelled faintly of wet cedar. Grace Holloway moved through the kitchen with her usual quiet rhythm, grinding coffee beans, flipping pancakes, humming an old hymn under her breath. Yet the house didn't feel the same. The walls seemed to listen, and the silence between footsteps felt heavier than before. Richard came in dressed for work, reading glasses perched low on his nose, a smile trying to hide the weariness beneath. "Morning, Grace." "Vanessa's planning a few changes around the house," he said casually. "You two should talk." Grace kept her tone light. "Of course, sir. Always happy to help." But when Vanessa appeared in the doorway, hair perfectly brushed, holding a tablet in her hand, Grace sensed those changes weren't small ones. "Morning, everyone," Vanessa said brightly. "I've been thinking this house could use a modern touch. New curtains, maybe new colors. I'm also reworking the staff schedule. I'll take over Lila's bedtime from now on." Grace froze at that last part. "Lila likes her stories before bed," she said softly. "They help her sleep." Vanessa's smile never faded. "I'm sure she'll adjust. Children do." The day unfolded with the rhythm of polite tension. Vanessa floated through each room, noting small imperfections, dust on the window frame, a stack of folded towels not perfectly aligned. She did it sweetly, with compliments wrapped in criticism. "You do such a thorough job, Grace," she'd say. "Though I imagine it must be hard to keep up at your age." Grace said nothing. She'd been in service long enough to know when a woman like Vanessa wasn't just organizing, she was claiming territory. By noon, the house looked different. Family photos of Richard's first wife quietly removed, fresh flowers placed in their stead, the scent of imported perfume replacing the homey smell of cinnamon and soap. At lunchtime, Grace took Lila to the Bluebonnet Diner, as they often did on Thursdays. The bell above the door jingled as they walked in, and the familiar smell of fried chicken and coffee wrapped around them. Old men in cowboy hats nodded hello. "Well, mornin', Miss Grace," called Betty, the waitress, wiping her hands on her apron. "How's that little angel today?" Lila smiled shyly, swinging her legs under the booth. "I'm fine, ma'am." They shared a plate of fries and split a slice of pie. Grace noticed how quiet Lila had become. No more chatter about school or her drawings. "Something on your mind, honey?" The little girl hesitated. "She told Daddy that you shouldn't be here so much. She said you make the house feel old." Grace's heart ached. She took the child's hand gently. "Sometimes, people say things that aren't true when they don't understand love. You just remember what's real, okay?" Lila nodded, but the shadow of worry didn't leave her eyes. That afternoon, when Grace returned home, she found Vanessa in the study. The woman was standing at Richard's desk, rearranging papers and drawers. Grace stopped in the doorway. "Is there something I can help you with?" Vanessa turned, calm as ever. "Oh, just tidying up. Richard's too busy to keep this place in order." Her tone was smooth, but Grace's eyes fell on the open bottle of heart medication near Vanessa's hand. "That's Mr. Whitmore's prescription," Grace said. "Yes," Vanessa replied. "I organize his pills now. I'm sure you don't mind." Grace hesitated, wanting to protest, but Vanessa's stare sharp and steady warned her that any challenge would be useless. That night, when Richard returned from the store, Vanessa greeted him with a kiss and a soft complaint about Grace hovering too much. The man laughed it off, tired and eager to avoid friction. Grace watched from the kitchen doorway, drying her hands on a towel, her heart sinking slowly, not because she feared Vanessa, but because she saw how easily good men believed a beautiful lie. When bedtime came, Lila begged Grace for a story, whispering, "Just one, please." But Vanessa appeared in the doorway with a soft voice that carried authority. "Off to bed, sweetheart. I'll read tonight." Grace kissed the girl's forehead, her smile trembling. "Sleep well, my little light." As she turned to leave, Lila clutched her sleeve. "Don't go far," she whispered. Grace nodded, though she knew things were already changing, not loudly, but quietly, like rot beneath fresh paint. The next week unfolded in small but steady waves of unease. The Whitmore house, once full of laughter and the smell of biscuits, now echoed with a different rhythm, soft footsteps, closed doors, and whispers that carried like wind through the hallway. Grace kept her routine. Up before dawn, breakfast on the table by 7, beds made by 9. But each day, she felt more like a guest in the home she had helped keep alive. Vanessa's influence grew in quiet, deliberate strokes. She ordered new curtains, pale gray ones that blocked the morning light Grace used to love. She replaced the cheerful kitchen rug with something sleek and colorless. Even the air seemed different now, cold, perfumed, careful. Grace told herself not to take it personally, but she felt the warmth of the home slipping through her fingers, like flour dust scattering off the counter. One afternoon, while dusting the sitting room, Grace overheard Vanessa on the phone. Her voice was sweet but clipped, businesslike. "Yes, I told him she's loyal, but too sentimental," she said softly. "People like her never know when to step aside." Grace stopped mid-motion, heart thudding. She pretended to adjust a vase until the conversation ended, then slipped quietly back to the kitchen, her face pale. That evening, Vanessa appeared with a piece of paper in hand, a formal notice. "Just so we're clear," she said lightly, "I've discussed this with Richard. You'll be taking some time off starting next week. We'll, of course, pay you through the holidays." Grace's throat tightened. "You mean I'm being dismissed?" Vanessa's smile never faltered. "Think of it as rest, dear. Surely you could use it after all these years." She folded the paper neatly on the counter and walked away, heels clicking against the tile. Grace stood still for a long moment, staring at the letter. Outside, the sky had begun to darken, clouds gathering again over the hills. Somewhere upstairs, Lila's laughter broke into a small cough, followed by silence. Later that night, Grace went to check on the child. The door to Lila's room was slightly ajar. She peeked in and saw Vanessa sitting beside the bed, reading from a glossy magazine instead of the usual bedtime storybook. Lila's eyes were open, staring at the ceiling. When she saw Grace in the doorway, her small hand lifted slightly, a quiet plea. "Go to sleep now, darling," Vanessa said without looking up. "We don't need distractions tonight." Grace closed the door softly and stepped back into the hallway, feeling helpless. The walls seemed to close in around her. Downstairs, she brewed a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly around the mug. When Richard returned from the shop, she tried to speak. "Sir," she began, "I think there's been some misunderstanding about my position here." But he interrupted gently, tired and distracted. "I know, Grace. Vanessa mentioned it. It's not permanent, just a few weeks off. You've been overworking yourself." "I'm fine," Grace said quietly. "Truly." Richard gave her a weary smile. "You've been like family to us, Grace. Please trust me on this." And that was the moment she realized he already believed whatever story Vanessa had spun. The following morning, Grace went to refill Richard's medication tray. The pill bottle looked different, same label, different handwriting on the refill note. When she asked Vanessa about it, the woman replied coolly, "Oh, I picked it up for him." The pharmacist made an adjustment. Grace frowned, uneasy. "Mr. Whitmore's dosage hasn't changed in years." "Then maybe it was overdue for a change," Vanessa said, slipping the bottle from Grace's hand. "Why don't you focus on your chores instead?" Grace watched her walk away, feeling the first sting of real fear. It wasn't only about her job anymore. Something darker was taking root. That night, when she tucked Lila into bed for what might be the last time, the little girl clung to her. "She said you're going away," Lila whispered, tears welling up. Grace brushed them away gently. "Only for a while, sweetheart. But who'll make pancakes? Who'll braid my hair?" Grace smiled, though her chest ached. "You'll be fine, my love. You're stronger than you think." Lightning flashed outside, lighting the child's face for a brief moment. In that instant, Lila looked so small, so frightened, that Grace almost promised she'd never leave. But she knew promises sometimes broke like fragile glass, and she couldn't bear to make one she might not keep. Downstairs, Vanessa poured herself a glass of wine, humming softly to the tune of the storm. She passed Grace in the hallway, her perfume heavy, her tone pleasant. "Get some rest," she said. "Big day tomorrow." When Grace reached her room, she found the termination letter neatly folded on her nightstand, as if it had been placed there on purpose. Her reflection in the mirror looked tired, older than she remembered. Outside, thunder rolled again. She sat on the edge of her bed, clasped her hands together, and whispered a prayer. "Lord, if I've got to walk through this fire, help me come out whole." From the window, the faint light from Vanessa's room glowed again. Grace turned away, her heart heavy with a truth she could not yet name but somehow already knew. The day Grace was told to leave came sooner than she expected. It was a Thursday, the kind of day that started out with sunshine so bright it almost felt like forgiveness. But by afternoon, the wind had turned dry and mean. The curtains Vanessa had chosen fluttered stiffly in their new places, and Grace could smell polish and bleach everywhere she went. The home she'd once cared for now felt like a stranger's house wearing the same skin. Richard had gone into town early for supplies, leaving Vanessa and Grace alone. Grace packed her few things quietly. The apron her late husband had bought her, the small Bible she kept by her bedside, and a photograph of little Lila holding a pumpkin at last year's festival. She'd planned to leave before the child returned from school, not wanting to make the goodbye harder than it needed to be. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. She was just tying the last string around her bag when the sound of the school bus brakes echoed down the gravel road. Her heart tightened. The door swung open before she could move. "Miss Grace!" Lila cried, running in, her backpack bouncing. "Daddy said you're going away. Tell me it's not true." Grace crouched, pulling the child into her arms. "I have to go for a little while, sweetheart. Just till things settle down." Tears welled in Lila's big blue eyes. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, honey," Grace whispered, holding her close. "You're the only thing that's ever been right." Vanessa appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, voice sharp. "That's enough, Lila. Go upstairs and wash up for dinner." The girl clung tighter. "No, she's my friend." Vanessa's tone softened just enough to sound sweet. "You'll see her again soon, darling. But right now, she needs to go." Grace stood, steady but trembling. "Let her be, ma'am. Goodbyes are hard enough without rushing them." For a moment, the two women stared at each other, one with quiet sorrow, the other with cold satisfaction. That night, the storm returned. The wind rattled the old house, thunder rolling low like the growl of something ancient. Grace sat awake in her small room, suitcase by her side, waiting for dawn to come so she could leave before the rain got worse. But sometime past midnight, she heard a sound faint, sharp, out of place. The shatter of glass. Her heart leapt. She hurried upstairs, her nightgown brushing the steps. The hallway lights were out, but the glow from Lila's room spilled under the door. She pushed it open. The window was cracked, the curtains whipping in the wind. Lila sat on her bed, eyes wide, clutching her teddy bear. "Sweetheart, what happened?" Grace rushed in, closing the window. The girl's voice shook. "I heard them yelling, Daddy and her. Then he fell." Grace froze. The words hit her like cold water. She ran into the hallway. A faint light glimmered from the study below. She raced down the stairs, her bare feet silent on the carpet. Richard Whitmore lay crumpled near the desk, one hand still clutching the edge of it. The pill bottle lay on the floor, its contents scattered like tiny white beads across the rug. "Mr. Whitmore!" Grace dropped to her knees, shaking him gently. "Richard, can you hear me?" No answer. Only the storm pounding against the windows. Vanessa stood behind her, pale but composed, a phone trembling in her hand. "I just called 911, she said softly. "He must have taken the wrong dose. I told him he shouldn't mix his medication with wine." Grace looked up at her, the realization dawning. "You were in here." Vanessa blinked, eyes wide, with mock innocence. "I tried to stop him, but when I came back, it was too late." Grace's breath caught, disbelief and fear swirling together. She looked back at the man on the floor, then at the woman standing above him, so calm, so sure of what she'd say next. Outside, lightning split the sky. The wail of sirens grew louder as red and blue lights flickered across the rain-soaked windows. Within minutes, the front yard filled with the hum of engines and the thud of boots on wet gravel. Sheriff Clay Daniels stepped inside, hat in hand, his face solemn. He'd known the Whitmores his whole life, baptized their daughter, sold hay with Richard every fall. He'd never seen the house so still. Grace knelt beside Richard, her dress damp from the rain she'd tracked in, her trembling hands still pressed to his shoulder. "Sheriff, please, he just collapsed," she said, her voice breaking. "We need a doctor." Clay crouched down, touched Richard's wrist, and slowly shook his head. "He's gone, Grace." The words cracked through her like thunder. Behind them, Vanessa sniffled softly into a handkerchief. "I tried to help him," she said, her voice quivering. "But Grace, she was here first. I found her with the bottle in her hand." Clay looked over, frowning. "That true, Grace? I picked it up off the floor," she stammered. "I was trying to see what happened. She was—" "She?" Vanessa interrupted, eyes wide with wounded innocence. "Are you accusing me?" The room spun. Grace looked around helplessly at the pills scattered across the carpet, the overturned glass of wine, the way Vanessa's tears seemed to glisten perfectly under the flashing lights. Paramedics moved in, covering Richard's body. Clay stood, rubbing his forehead. "I've got to ask you to come with us, Grace, just until we get this sorted out." Grace's heart pounded. "Sheriff, you've known me 10 years. I would never—" He looked down, regret in his eyes. "I know, but the evidence, it don't look good. We found your fingerprints on the bottle. We just gotta ask some questions is all." Vanessa's voice broke softly behind them. "She was always jealous of me, Clay. Always tried to keep Richard and Lila to herself. I begged her to let go, but she couldn't." Grace stared at her, speechless. "That's a lie." But no one seemed to hear. Upstairs, Lila stood at the top of the stairs, in her nightgown, clutching her teddy bear, eyes wide with confusion. "Miss Grace?" she whispered. "Why are the police here?" Grace looked up at her, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Go back to bed, sweetheart." Her voice shook. "It's going to be all right." But even she didn't believe it. The deputies led her outside, the rain pelting down, mud splattering her shoes. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as word spread through the town faster than lightning. Grace caught sight of Vanessa standing on the porch, a black umbrella shielding her from the storm. Their eyes met for a heartbeat. Vanessa's face was perfectly composed, a widow already mastering her role. In the back seat of the cruiser, Grace pressed her forehead to the cold glass, the rain blurring her reflection into a shadow. Behind her, the Whitmore house loomed like a ghost once a home, now a grave for truth. As they drove away, Lila's small voice echoed faintly through the rain. She had run out onto the porch, her bare feet splashing in puddles, calling after the car. She didn't do it. The sheriff didn't turn around. Grace closed her eyes and whispered a single prayer, the same one her mother had taught her. "Lord, be my witness when the world will not." At that moment, thunder crashed again, and a gust of wind slammed the door of the house behind Vanessa, sealing in the lie that would change everything. By the time the cruiser disappeared down the hill, the town's lights had gone dim. Only the church bell rang in the distance, slow and mournful, counting the beats of a life undone. That night, Fayetteville's peace was buried with Richard Whitmore. Morning came gray and heavy over Fayetteville. The storm had passed, but the town didn't feel washed clean. It felt stripped bare. The news of Richard Whitmore's death spread before sunrise, carried by whispers through the diner, the church steps, and the grocery store aisles. By 8 o'clock, everyone had an opinion, and most of them pointed to Grace Holloway. She sat in the small holding cell at the county sheriff's office, her hands folded in her lap, her heart caught somewhere between disbelief and prayer. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Sheriff Clay Daniels came in, hat in hand, his eyes tired. "Grace," he said quietly, "you need to tell me everything again. From the moment you walked into that study." She told him again every detail she could remember. The glass on the floor, the pills scattered, the sound of Vanessa's voice calling for help. "I swear, Clay, I didn't touch his medicine. You know me." Clay sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know, but Vanessa says otherwise. And There's fingerprints on the bottle, yours and hers. Problem is, hers makes sense. She was his wife. Yours don't." Grace looked up at him weary. "Because I cleaned this house for 10 years, Clay. Of course my prints are on everything." He didn't answer. His silence said more than words could. Outside the window, the church bell rang, the same one that used to call her to morning service every Sunday. Now, it felt like a funeral bell for her name. Meanwhile, at the Whitmore house, Vanessa wore black, her grief perfectly rehearsed. Neighbors brought casseroles and condolences, whispering their sympathy between spoonfuls of gossip. "Such a tragedy," they said. "And that poor woman, imagine trusting someone like Grace with your home." Lila, small and pale, sat on the staircase, clutching her teddy bear, watching it all. She didn't understand why people looked at her with pity, or why no one would tell her where Miss Grace had gone. When she asked Vanessa, the woman knelt beside her, voice smooth as honey. "She did something very bad, darling. Sometimes people we love make mistakes too big to fix." Lila shook her head fiercely. "She didn't do anything." Vanessa's smile hardened. "You're too young to understand." That night, Grace lay awake on the narrow jail cot, staring at the ceiling. Each sound from outside, a train in the distance, a dog barking, the wind shifting through trees, felt like a piece of the world still moving without her. She prayed for strength, for truth, for Lila's safety. But miles away, in the Whitmore house, the truth was being rewritten. Vanessa had already spoken to a lawyer, already told her version of the story to anyone who'd listen. And the town, eager for simple answers, believed her. At dawn, Sheriff Daniels came back, holding a file. "Grace," he said, "the coroner found traces of heart medication in Richard's system, too much of it. Looks like an overdose." Grace swallowed hard. "But he didn't do that to himself." "I know what you're saying," Clay replied. "But there's nothing proving otherwise." She leaned forward, her voice trembling. "And the pills, they weren't the same kind. I saw the label. Vanessa changed them." "End quote." Clay hesitated, the words hanging in the air. "You have proof of that?" "No," Grace whispered. "Just what I saw." He sighed. "Then all I've got is your word against hers." Grace closed her eyes, whispering, "Then, Lord, let my word be enough." That morning, the headlines in the local paper read, "Local businessman, D's suddenly housekeeper under investigation." And just like that, Grace Holloway, the woman who had fed half the town during storms and sung hymns at every funeral, became the villain in their story. 3 days passed before Grace was released on bail. The bond money came quietly, without explanation, an envelope of cash delivered by Martha Briggs, the elderly gardener who had worked part-time for the Whitmores for years. "Don't thank me," Martha said softly as she helped Grace into her old pickup truck. "Just promise me you'll keep your chin up." Grace smiled faintly. "Bless you, Martha. I don't know why you believe me." Martha started the engine, eyes fixed on the road. "Because I've seen enough liars in my life to know what truth looks like." The drive home was silent, except for the hum of tires on the highway. Fayetteville rolled by the same storefronts, the same church steeple, but every face seemed different now. People looked away when Grace passed. At the diner, Betty, the waitress, turned her back mid-sentence. It was as though the whole town had decided she was guilty before the law ever could. Grace's small cottage sat at the edge of the woods, a mile from town. When she opened the door, the smell of dust and cedar greeted her like an old friend. Everything was just as she'd left it, except quieter. She set her bag down and stood in the middle of the room, unsure what to do first. After a moment, she went to the window, watching the sun fall behind the trees. "You and me again, Lord," she whispered. "Just you and me." Meanwhile, back at the Whitmore house, the cracks in Vanessa's perfect story had already begun to show. Lila refused to eat. She asked for Miss Grace every night, and when Vanessa told her to stop, she started having nightmares. Sometimes she'd wake screaming, convinced that Grace was standing outside in the rain, calling her name. Vanessa tried to comfort her, but the little girl only turned away. At school, Lila drew pictures of a house with dark clouds above it, a woman crying beside a window. Her teacher, Mrs. Keller, grew concerned and called Vanessa for a meeting. "Children express grief differently," Mrs. Keller said gently. "But Lila seems convinced her caretaker was innocent." Vanessa forced a smile. "Imagination," she said. "It'll pass." That night, Lila overheard Vanessa on the phone. The woman's voice, usually smooth, was sharp and low. "No, they can't test that bottle again. It's already in evidence," she hissed. "Do you understand? I can't afford another mistake." Lila froze in the hallway, clutching her teddy bear. The words didn't make full sense, but the tone did. Fear crawled up her spine. The next afternoon, when Vanessa went into town, Lila slipped into her stepmother's room. She searched quietly drawers, desk, dresser, until she found a small box under the bed. Inside were several pill bottles, each with different labels, some half empty. The handwriting on one was shaky, not like the neat script from the pharmacy. Lila's hands trembled as she read the name, Richard Whitmore. She stuffed the bottle into her pocket just as she heard the car pull into the driveway. Heart racing, she closed the drawer and ran to her room, tucking the bottle behind her bookshelf. That evening, Vanessa noticed something out of place, the box slightly ajar. She froze, then smiled coldly. "So," she whispered, "someone's been curious." Across town, Grace sat at her kitchen table with Martha, sipping weak coffee. The older woman leaned in. "I shouldn't say this, but something about Vanessa never sat right with me. The way she handled that medicine, and the way she cried at the funeral, like an actress who knew all her lines." Grace frowned. "You think she?" Martha shook her head. "I think you need someone to help you find the truth." She reached into her purse and slid a small card across the table. "Amelia Cross, lawyer from Austin, used to handle wrongful cases. She owes me a favor." Grace turned the card in her hand, hope flickering for the first time in days. "Maybe," she whispered. "God hasn't forgotten me after all." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain again, the same kind of wind that had come before every storm in her life. But this time, Grace didn't close the window. She let it in. Somewhere across town, a little girl lay awake, clutching a secret in the dark. And for the first time since Richard's death, truth had begun to stir quiet, fragile, and unstoppable. The morning sun rose soft and golden over Fayetteville, laying a tender light across the rooftops. It had been a week since Grace's release, and though she was free in body, the town's whispers clung to her like dust. But that morning brought something new, a faint flicker of hope in the shape of a business card resting on her table. Amelia Cross, attorney at law. Amelia arrived that afternoon in a silver sedan that looked too polished for the dusty backroads of Fayette County. She was in her early 30s, tall, with dark hair, pinned neatly, and a confidence that didn't need to announce itself. When she stepped onto Grace's porch, she took in the sight of the small house, the worn rocking chair, the Bible on the table, the coffee steaming in 2 chipped mugs. "You make it hard not to feel at home here," she said with a warm smile. Grace, who hadn't smiled in days, finally managed one. "That's all I ever wanted this place to be, a home." They sat together for hours, Grace recounting every detail from that terrible night. Amelia took notes carefully, her pen scratching across the pad. "So you're saying the pills looked different before Mr. Whitmore died?" "Yes," Grace said. "The label changed. The handwriting, too. And Vanessa picked up the refill?" "She said she did." Amelia nodded, eyes narrowing slightly. "Then that's where we start. If the pharmacy records don't match, we'll have something solid." That evening, Amelia drove back into town and stopped at the Fayette Pharmacy. The pharmacist, an older man named Russ Porter, recognized her from church. "Miss Cross," he greeted, wiping his glasses. "What brings a lawyer from Austin all the way out here?" "Just looking into a refill," she said. "For Richard Whitmore, around the week of his passing." Russ frowned and flipped through his logbook. "Funny thing," he said slowly. "That refill wasn't picked up here. Someone called in for a transfer to another branch in Austin. Said it was authorized by Mrs. Whitmore. Amelia's pulse quickened. "And you never spoke to Mr. Whitmore about it yourself?" "No, ma'am. Only her." That night, under the soft hum of her car's dashboard light, Amelia called Grace. "You were right," she said. "Those pills didn't come from here." Grace's voice trembled. "Then someone switched them," Amelia exhaled. "And I think I know who." Back at the Whitmore house, Lila sat on her bed, clutching the hidden bottle she had taken days ago. She hadn't told anyone, not even her teacher, but something in her small heart told her this was important. She traced the crooked handwriting on the label with her finger. She didn't understand what it meant, but she knew it didn't belong. "Miss Grace wouldn't hurt Daddy," she whispered into the dark. "I'll prove it." Downstairs, Vanessa was on the phone again, pacing. "I don't care what the lawyer says," she snapped. "As long as that woman keeps her mouth shut, we're fine." She stopped suddenly, noticing the shadow of tiny feet under the crack of the door. Lila? But by the time she opened it, the hallway was empty. Outside, the wind rustled through the oak trees, carrying the faintest scent of rain again, as if the earth itself remembered what had been buried there. 2 days later, Fayetteville woke under a slow drizzle. The kind of rain that didn't pour, but lingered, gentle, steady, the way sorrow sometimes does. Grace stood by her window, watching it fall, her mind replaying Amelia's words. The refill came from Austin. Someone tampered with it. That meant she wasn't crazy. It meant the truth had a heartbeat again. At the same time, in the old brick schoolhouse near the church, Lila sat in class, staring at the bottle hidden in her backpack. The world around her had become smaller since Grace left. Everything felt quieter, flatter, wrong. She had started drawing Miss Grace in her notebooks, sometimes holding her hand, sometimes standing in the rain, smiling through it. When recess came, she slipped out the side gate and ran down the road to Martha Briggs's small cottage near the cemetery. Martha was trimming her rose bushes when she saw the little figure hurrying toward her, soaked and breathless. "Lila Whitmore," Martha said, wiping her hands. "You're supposed to be in school." The girl looked up, eyes full of determination, far too big for her small face. "I need to show you something." Inside, by the fire, Lila pulled out the pill bottle. Martha's hands trembled when she read the crooked label. "Where did you get this, sweetheart?" "From under her bed," Lila whispered. "It has Daddy's name, but Miss Grace said the handwriting was wrong." Martha drew a slow breath. "You did right coming here." "I?" She poured the girl a cup of warm milk and made her promise to keep quiet. After Lila left, Martha called Amelia. "You better come quick," she said. "The child's got something that'll blow this case open." That evening, Amelia and Grace met Martha at her cottage. The storm had returned, wind sweeping through the fields like restless ghosts. Martha handed over the bottle carefully. "She's just a little girl," she said. "But she's braver than half the town." Amelia examined the label under her flashlight. "The handwriting's identical to the prescription transfer form from Austin," she murmured. "It's hers, Vanessa's." Grace felt her knees weaken. "Then it's true." Amelia nodded. "It's evidence, real evidence." For a long moment, the three women sat in silence, the fire crackling softly. Grace's eyes shone in the flicker of the flames. "I'll never forget that child," she whispered. "God sent her when everyone else turned away." Outside, headlights glowed through the rain. A car rolled slowly past the house, its tires crunching over gravel. Amelia peeked through the curtain and caught a glimpse of a silver sedan, the same one Vanessa drove. "She knows," Amelia said quietly. Grace's pulse quickened. "If she finds out Lila took that bottle?" "She won't," Amelia interrupted. "I'll take it to the courthouse first thing in the morning. Tonight, you stay here." But as the hours crept by, none of them could sleep. Grace sat by the window, watching the road. Each gust of wind rattled the panes like a warning. She thought of Lila's small hands, her trembling voice, her faith. At the Whitmore house, Vanessa stood in her dressing room, staring into the mirror. Her reflection looked perfect, every curl in place, her lipstick flawless, but her eyes betrayed the cracks. "You shouldn't have gone snooping, little girl," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the storm. "You shouldn't have." That night, the clock in Grace's cottage struck midnight, and thunder rolled again over Fayetteville. Inside, on the table by the window, the pill bottle sat like a silent witness, small, ordinary, yet powerful enough to tear a lie wide open. And somewhere in the distance, a child dreamed of holding Miss Grace's hand again, because sometimes, even in the darkest storms, truth still knows how to find its way home. The courthouse of Fayette County stood at the center of town, an old brick building with white columns that had seen 100 years of justice and just as many mistakes. That Monday morning, the flag hung limp in the still air as the townsfolk gathered on the steps, murmuring, clutching their umbrellas. Inside, The air smelled of wood polish and rain-soaked clothes. It was the kind of day when even the truth felt heavy. Grace Holloway sat at the defense table beside Amelia Cross, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her heart thudded slow but steady. Across the aisle, Vanessa Sterling sat dressed in black, her hair perfectly pinned, eyes hidden behind a veil of sorrow that fooled almost everyone in the room. The judge entered, his gavel striking once. "Court is now in session for the state of Texas versus Grace Holloway," he announced. Amelia leaned close. "Just breathe," she whispered. "We have what we need." The prosecution opened with a voice smooth as oil. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is simple. A housekeeper trusted, respected, became jealous of her employer's new wife and poisoned him out of resentment. The evidence speaks for itself." He lifted the plastic evidence bag containing the pill bottle. Her fingerprints, her access, her motive. Grace looked down, her throat tightening. The room blurred around her as whispers rippled through the gallery. When it was Amelia's turn, she rose calmly.
"The prosecution tells you this is simple,"
she began. "But life rarely is. You'll hear about loyalty mistaken for jealousy, kindness mistaken for guilt, and truth twisted by someone who feared being exposed." Her gaze flicked toward Vanessa. "This case isn't about resentment. It's about deception." A hush fell over the room. Vanessa's lips pressed into a line. By afternoon, witnesses took the stand. Sheriff Clay Daniels testified first, looking uneasy. "Grace was at the scene when we arrived," he said. "She had the bottle in her hand." Amelia stood. "Sheriff, you've known the defendant for years, haven't you?" "Yes, ma'am." "Would you describe her as a violent person?" He hesitated. "No, Mom. Never." "And in your investigation, did you find any evidence she purchased or handled medication besides what she cleaned from the house?" "No, ma'am." So the only proof tying her to this crime is that she was there in a home she'd worked in for a decade?" Clay sighed. "That's right." Murmurs spread through the courtroom again. Amelia turned to the jury, her voice steady. "Sometimes, being in the wrong place at the wrong time is all it takes to destroy a good person's name." After a recess, Vanessa took the stand. The room seemed to shrink around her as she adjusted the microphone delicately. "I loved my husband," she began, her voice trembling just enough. "Grace was possessive, controlling. I tried to include her, but she resented me from the start." Amelia's expression didn't change. When it was her turn to cross-examine, she approached slowly, every step deliberate. "Mrs. Sterling, could you tell the court where you filled Mr. Whitmore's last prescription?" Vanessa hesitated. "At the local pharmacy, of course." Amelia held up a folder. "You're certain?" "Yes." "M. Then how do you explain this?" She opened the folder and produced a document, the transfer authorization to an Austin pharmacy. The signature at the bottom, neat and curved, read Vanessa Sterling. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Vanessa blinked, her composure cracking for the first time. That's not mine." Amelia tilted her head slightly. "You deny writing your own name?" The judge banged his gavel for silence, but the murmuring only deepened. Grace sat frozen, her pulse roaring in her ears. Vanessa's hands trembled. I must have forgotten. It was a difficult time." Amelia leaned in, her voice quiet but cutting. "You forgot authorizing a prescription that killed your husband?" The courtroom fell silent. Grace closed her eyes, whispering a prayer she hadn't dared to hope before. "Lord, let the truth keep breathing." Oh? Outside, rain began again, tapping against the tall windows like a reminder, soft but relentless, that storms never end without washing something clean. The next morning, the courthouse filled even earlier. Every pew creaked under the weight of curious neighbors who had come to watch the story unfold. The trial had turned the quiet town into a stage, and today, a small child was about to speak on it. Lila Whitmore sat in the front row beside her teacher, Mrs. Keller. Her small hands fidgeted with the hem of her dress. When the judge called her name, she hesitated, glancing toward Amelia, who gave her an encouraging nod. "It's all right, sweetheart," Amelia said softly. "Just tell the truth, the way you always do." The little girl climbed onto the witness chair. Her feet didn't reach the floor, and someone handed her a small cushion so the microphone could catch her voice. The bailiff smiled kindly. "Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Lila nodded. "Yes, sir." The courtroom fell into a silence so deep it could have been a prayer. Amelia stepped forward. Lila, do you remember the night your father passed away? Lila's lower lip trembled. Yes, ma'am. Can you tell the court what you saw? I was in bed. I heard them yelling Daddy and Miss Vanessa. Then Daddy fell, and Miss Grace came in. And did Miss Grace ever hurt your father? Her eyes widened. No, she tried to help him. She was crying. The prosecutor stood quickly. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is a child. Her memory may be unreliable. The judge looked over his glasses. Overruled. Proceed, Miss Cross. Amelia crouched slightly, so she was eye level with the girl. Lila, do you know what this is? She held up the pill bottle sealed in an evidence bag. Lila nodded. It was under Miss Vanessa's bed. And gasps rippled through the room. Amelia gently placed a copy of the pharmacy transfer beside it. And did anyone tell you to find it? No, Lila said firmly. I just wanted to help Miss Grace. Vanessa's face drained of color. That's absurd, she burst out, rising from her seat. She's lying. The judge's gavel slammed. Mrs. Sterling, sit down! But it was too late. The crowd had already turned toward her, eyes narrowing. Amelia's voice stayed calm, steady. Mrs. Sterling, do you deny that this bottle was found in your home? I don't know how it got there. Amelia lifted the document again. Then perhaps you can explain why your signature authorized a prescription transfer that never passed through your husband's doctor. The judge leaned forward, frowning. Mrs. Sterling, I strongly advise you to answer. For the first time, Vanessa faltered. Her polished poise cracked, her words stumbling. I just wanted to help him sleep. He was tired all the time. I didn't mean... Her voice broke off as the courtroom gasped. Grace felt her breath catch. Even after everything, part of her heart still hurt watching another soul unravel. Vanessa's lawyer tried to intervene, whispering frantically, but the damage was done. The prosecutor's face went pale. The judge's gavel echoed once more. We'll recess for 30 minutes, he said. As people poured into the hallway, Sheriff Clay approached Amelia. I just got word from the Austin PD, he murmured. That signature on the transfer? Confirmed match to Vanessa Sterling. Amelia exhaled slowly. Then we're almost there. Grace turned to see Lila sitting quietly on the bench, clutching her teddy bear. The girl looked up, her eyes tired but shining. Did I do good, Miss Grace? Grace knelt, tears welling. You did more than good, sweetheart. You told the truth when no one else would. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight spilled through the courthouse windows, warm and golden, the first real light Fayetteville had seen in months. But as the recess ended and the doors opened again, Grace knew the storm wasn't over yet. Vanessa had stopped crying. Her eyes were cold again, calculating. As she sat back down, she whispered to her lawyer, her voice a thread of venom. If I'm going down, she's coming with me. Grace felt the chill crawl up her spine. The gavel struck. Court is back in session. And in that moment, everyone in the room knew the truth had finally found its voice. But the fight was far from finished. The final day of trial began beneath a sky scrubbed clean by rain. The courthouse steps glistened, and a hush hung over Fayetteville as people gathered once again, not for gossip this time, but for something they hadn't dared to hope for, the truth. Inside, Grace Holloway sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. She felt calm now, like someone standing at the edge of a storm who finally sees sunlight breaking through the clouds. Amelia Cross stood beside her, leafing through papers, steady and focused. Across the room, Vanessa Sterling looked composed again, but her eyes had lost their practiced shine. There was a faint tremor in her hands as she smoothed her skirt. When the judge entered, all rose. Court is back in session, he said. His tone carried the weight of days filled with tension, lies, and unspoken prayers. Amelia began her closing argument. She stepped toward the jury box, voice soft but certain. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard from witnesses, seen documents, and listened to the child's brave testimony. But this case is not just about evidence. It's about conscience. She paused, letting the room breathe. Grace Holloway spent 10 years serving that family. She raised a little girl who still calls her home, and the only thing she's guilty of is love the kind that doesn't fade even when it's turned away. Her voice strengthened. The bottle, the forged signature, the confession, nearly spoken, all point to one truth. A man died because of deceit, not devotion. I'm asking you to listen not just with your minds, but with your hearts, because sometimes justice needs both. The courtroom was silent when she finished. The prosecutor offered a weak rebuttal, but his words landed hollow. Everyone knew the tide had turned. The judge called for a brief recess before the verdict. Grace stood and turned toward Amelia, tears in her eyes. "No matter what happens, you've given me something I thought I'd lost," she said softly. "My dignity." Amelia smiled. "You'll get more than that before this day ends." In the hallway, Sheriff Clay approached. "The handwriting experts finished their report," he said quietly. "It's a full match to Vanessa, no doubt." Amelia's eyes hardened. "Then she's out of lies." Back inside, the court reconvened. The judge's gavel fell once more. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, "you've been accused of tampering with medical evidence and providing false testimony. Do you wish to speak before I address the jury?" Vanessa hesitated. The room seemed to lean forward, waiting. Her lawyer whispered frantically, but she raised a trembling hand. "I didn't mean to kill him," she said, her voice cracking. "It was supposed to make him rest, just rest. He loved her more than me." She gestured toward Grace, tears now, real, messy. "I couldn't stand it. I wanted her gone." Gasps rippled through the room. The judge's gavel struck again. "Order!" Grace closed her eyes, her heart breaking not with anger, but with sorrow. Vanessa's confession hung in the air, sharp and final. The judge turned to the jury. "You are dismissed to deliberate, though I doubt it will take long." It didn't. Within an hour, they returned. The foreman stood, voice steady. "We find the defendant, Grace Holloway, not guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted half in applause, half in stunned silence. Grace covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Amelia put a gentle arm around her. "It's over," she whispered. But Grace shook her head slowly. "No, not over. Not yet." Emsel, because even as freedom settled over her, she thought of Lila, the child who had told the truth when no one else dared. And she knew her life's work now wasn't to clear her name, but to make sure that little girl never forgot what courage looked like. Outside, the courthouse doors opened to sunlight. Grace stepped into it, blinking against the brightness. Reporters called her name. People reached out to touch her hand. But she only looked toward the far end of the street, where a small figure waited with a teddy bear in her arms. Lila ran the moment she saw her. Grace dropped to her knees, arms wide. The child crashed into her embrace, sobbing into her shoulder. "I knew you didn't do it," Lila whispered. Grace held her tighter. "And I knew you'd help me prove it." The church bell rang again, not mournful this time, but bright, clear, almost joyful. For the first time in months, Fayetteville sounded alive. The verdict came quicker than anyone expected. When the jury returned, the courtroom went still. "We find the defendant, Grace Holloway, not guilty on all counts." For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then a single sob, Lila's, broke the silence. Grace covered her face, trembling, and Amelia gripped her shoulder, whispering, "It's done." Oh. Across the aisle, Vanessa sat frozen. Her perfect poise was gone. The deputies stepped forward as the judge's voice cut through the noise. "Mrs. Sterling, you are under arrest for evidence tampering and obstruction of justice." The silver bracelets clicked around her wrists. For the first time, Vanessa looked small. Grace rose, her voice quiet but steady. "I forgive you," she said simply. The courtroom fell silent again, not out of shock, but reverence. Outside, sunlight spilled over the courthouse steps. Lila was waiting, clutching her teddy bear. When she saw Grace, she ran straight into her arms. Grace knelt, holding the child tight as the church bell began to ring, bright and clear. "See?" Lila whispered. "The truth wins." Grace smiled through her tears. "Always, sweetheart, always." And for the first time in months, Fayetteville felt clean again, washed in light after a long, hard storm. Autumn came back to Fayetteville the way forgiveness comes to a wounded heart, slowly, quietly, but for good. The air smelled of pecan pie and wood smoke again, and the church bell rang each Sunday without sadness. Grace Holloway had returned to her small cottage on Maple Street. The neighbors waved now when she passed. Some even brought flowers, shame softening their faces. She didn't hold grudges that wasn't in her nature. People believe what they're told, she said to Amelia one morning at the diner. But kindness lasts longer than gossip. Amelia smiled over her coffee. You're the only client I've had who comforts everyone else after winning a case. Grace chuckled. I guess some storms wash you clean enough to start over. Later that afternoon, Lila arrived with her grandmother for a visit. The girl ran straight to Grace's arms, her laughter filling the quiet house like sunlight through dusty windows. They baked biscuits, braided hair, and sang the same hymn they once hummed in the kitchen before everything changed. When Lila looked up and said, I wish Daddy could see us, Grace smiled softly. He does, sweetheart. He's right where peace lives in the truth. Outside, leaves drifted across the yard like little amber prayers. That evening, Grace stood on her porch, the sky turning gold over the fields. In the distance, she could see the courthouse clock glowing in the last light, not as a reminder of pain, but of justice done right. She closed her eyes and whispered, Thank you, Lord, for second chances. And as the night fell gentle and still, Fayetteville felt whole again, a small Texas town where a child's courage, a woman's faith, and the quiet power of forgiveness had proven that even after the darkest storm, the heart always finds its way home. Sometimes, after the heaviest storms, the world looks gentler. The sky over Fayetteville turned gold again, and the sound of that church bell no longer mourned but promised. Grace, Lila, and the town that once judged her found peace not in a courtroom, but in their own hearts. The wind carried forgiveness through the pecan trees, and if you stood on Maple Street at sunset, you could almost hear laughter in the air again, soft and free. This story reminds us that love the quiet, steadfast kind can heal what injustice breaks. Redemption doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it lives in the way we choose to forgive, or the way a child dares to speak the truth. Like a porch light left burning on a long Texas night, simple goodness has a way of guiding us home no matter how far we've wandered. In a world that moves too fast, maybe it's worth slowing down to share a cup of coffee, listen to an old hymn, or tell someone they're still loved. Those small moments of kindness are what build a home stronger than any wall, and they remind us that everyone, no matter their past, deserves a second chance at family and faith. So tonight, dear friends, as you sit by your window or rest after supper, think about who in your life might be waiting for forgiveness, or maybe for a little bit of understanding. Because like Grace learned, happiness doesn't come from what we own, but from who we hold close and what we choose to let go. If this story touched your heart, comment 1 below, and if you'd like to share your thoughts or see something done differently, press 0. And remember, if this tale brought you a moment of warmth, I invite you to stay, to listen, and to share, because stories like this aren't just told, they're lived.